Together, books 8 and 9 of Plato's Republic give this very exciting and insightful account of the development of different political regimes and how that's interwoven with the development of different kinds of psychological types or certain kinds of character. In Book 9, that political story is basically completed. That's been left in Book 8. And now it exclusively focuses on the psychological developments in the soul of the tyrant. He begins then by saying, recall the character we attributed to the man of the people, i.e. the democratic man. And he says there he was presumably produced by being reared from youth by a stingy father who honored only the money-making desires while despising the ones that aren't necessary. Well, that's referring back to a discussion in Book 8 that runs basically starts at 558 C and goes to 562A of the Genesis of the Democratic Man. And I want to turn to a little bit of that to get the story here. So, in fact, remember even a little bit before that, where the oligarchic man had come from. The oligarchic man, he said, that's the person whose father was honor-loving, but in a situation where people were now money-loving, he got taken to court or sort of wiped out and lost everything. And so the son grew up with poverty or the threat of poverty. And so he became, out of fear, very oriented towards making sure he had a lot of money. And that's the money-making oligarchic man coming into being. And so he is very stingy, and he makes this distinction. Some of my desires are necessary, and some of them are not, and I'm only going to fulfill those necessary ones. Right? And so that's where this guy comes from. And so he says, okay, imagine now that guy is your dad, and you have to grow up with that. And he says, this is where we're going to see how the democratic man comes into being. And, the point is, as a son growing up, as a child growing up, you're living under a kind of an oppressive regime. That dad had his reason for wanting to make that decision about his desire so he could protect himself. But now you're growing up with this really relatively wealthy father who's not letting you do anything you want to do. He's giving you this sort of harsh regime. And so the son growing up with a stingy dad feels oppressed. And on the other hand, sees around him other people who get to do things that they like and that they want to do, and his dad won't let him do that. And so he's drawn by those people who say, come on, you should go, have fun. You should do those things your dad says you can't do. Right? And so he says about that at 560 A and B, he says, desires reared in secret due to his father's lack of knowledge about rearing come to be in him many and strong, right? The very desires his dad says you got to get rid of are going to grow up in that boy, and he's going to say, I want to fulfill those, but they're going to grow up in secret because he can't let his dad see them. Right? But one other thing he says here about the rearing of the democratic man, he says, when he's a young man, reared, as we were just saying, without education and stingily. We've just been talking about the stinginess, but the without education is relevant too, right? Remember when we were talking about the timocrats and the oligarchs, we were talking about people essentially in that kind of world of Sparta, right? And that's a world, it valued gymnastic, it valued the hunt, and later it valued money-making, but it did not value the arts, right? And that was one of the points that Socrates was really making. Like, in all those contexts, in those whole societies, like a human world is being built up that isn't taking care of, the higher faculties. Right? Courage in war is like the highest thing it basically imagines, right? And so he said, this is when he was talking initially about the timocrat. He said, this person who loves gymnastic and so on has been abandoned by the best guardian. And what's that? Adeimantus asked. And Socrates says, argument mixed with music. It alone, when it is present, dwells within the one possessing it as a savior of virtue throughout life. That savior of virtue throughout life is not what the oligarchic father is going to instill in the son. He's going to think that kind of stuff is pretty unnecessary. Right? And so you have a person growing up in a context that's not cultivating the arts and the higher faculties, but is also saying you got to be really stingy and disciplined. So you think, what's it like for that kid? Well, he's got to, in secret, cultivate these desires that should be fulfilled, but that his dad's being really harsh about. He sees people around him encouraging that, and he also doesn't have his mind being cultivated exactly. And so he says, going back to 560b, those desires have been reared in secret. They took the acropolis of the young man's soul, perceiving that it was empty of fair studies and practices and true speeches. And it's these that are the best watchmen and guardians in the thought of men whom the gods love. Right? So again, he's repeating this point, like in this young man's soul, he doesn't have good education guarding over things to make sure that his life is being lived well. And so, these desires and the people who speak on behalf of those desires are there, ready to take over how that guy's soul is going to run. And so he says, in the absence of fair studies and practices and true speeches, false and boasting speeches and opinions ran up and seized that place in such a young man. That, he's using the sort of metaphor of seizing the city, in a kind of revolution. But the point is then, when it comes time for him to think about things, he doesn't have really good education to turn to. He's got on the one hand, he's got the example of his dad. On the other hand, he's got, the speeches that people make about how you should behave. And what is it that's being spoken on behalf of? Well, you should fulfill your desires, right? And he says what those false and boasting speeches are like. He says those boasting speeches close the gates of the kingly wall within him, like they don't let other things in. And he says they name shame simplicity and push it out with dishonor, and they call moderation cowardliness, and they banish it. And a little later he says, so the desires are let in, they're flattered, and they're flattered, but in this way they call insolence good education, they call anarchy freedom, they call wastefulness magnificence, and they call shamelessness courage. So, you've got this person who has his dad raising him in one way, but on the other hand, all around you have a certain kind of rhetoric of desire and what form that should take. And, I especially would pick up on this one about calling shamelessness courage. This boy growing up, really feels like there's some things he shouldn't do. His dad has, tried to, in his own way, insist on his son being a strong man of good character, moderate in his desires and whatever else. And there is some significant truth in that, right? There are some things you should control in yourself. Like we looked at that when we looked at character in book 4. We talked about what courage is and what moderation is and so on. And so, that in some ways, that dad is insisting on virtue. And there will be some real good that will come from the kind of discipline his dad is demanding. But on the other hand, you have these people around you saying, oh, you're just a coward for not being prepared to do this or that. Like, you should just take stuff. You should just, don't worry about whatever. Don't worry about being nice to people or whatever. People are surrounded by, these voices that just say, oh, you should just go for it. Don't worry about those people who tell you should hold yourself back. Like they're just trying to make you weak. So, for the young man growing up, he's got some dimensions of good character being instilled in him, but without a lot of insight behind that, and without him having a developed appreciation of why it's good to be good. And on the other hand, he's got a lot of boasting speeches that say people who are willing just to do anything and don't have, moral standards, they just go for what they want. Those are the people who are brave. Those are the people who are strong. And you don't do it just because you're weak and cowardly. That's kind of the thing this guy has to deal with. And again, think back to Glaucon at the beginning of book 2. Glaucon says, well, I basically have a sense that I should be a just and a good guy. Yet these speeches by Thrasymachus that basically say you should just go for it, they seem pretty convincing. I've never heard a good argument against them. And that's the decision a person has to make, right? And so, going back now to book 9, Socrates says about this guy, so the young man grows up with a stingy father, but then he spends time with people who are full of those just other kinds of desires. So he does indulge himself in that a bit, and he assumes the form of those other men out of a hatred of his father's stinginess. He really doesn't like the way his dad treats him. So in fact, it's worth emphasizing that point too. It's not just that those other things are appealing and he's doing them because of their intrinsic desirability. He also is doing them because he hates his dad. He's really mad about that. And so it's worth seeing that part of the motivation for pursuing exousia, licensing yourself to do whatever you want, is reactive, right? The desire he's fulfilling is not just the one he thinks he's fulfilling. In fulfilling those desires to do all these other sorts of things, in a deeper level, what he's fulfilling is his desire to get back at his dad, or he's working out his dealings with his dad through dealing with those other things. So, it's worth noticing right here, this pretty important point, that our own relationship to our desires is a little bit complicated, and we don't always do things for the reasons we imagine that we are. Right? But anyway, sort of hatred for his father's stinginess, he goes along with these guys who are into exousia, guys who are into doing whatever they want. But because he has a nature better than that, he's drawn in both directions, right? The thing I was just saying. And so the democratic man, Socrates says, is the one who comes into being by settling down in the middle between them. He doesn't just go in for doing any old thing, though he sees the appeal of that. And as Glaucon said about Thrasymachus' argument, he can't really come up with any good argument against that. But on the other hand, he holds on to a certain kind of developed character, a good character, that has come from being forced to be disciplined because of his dad. And so he lives a life that is neither illiberal, like he's not going to be, exactly stingy and unwilling to live freely like his dad. But on the other hand, he's not going to be hostile to law, because he's going to accept, there's some reasons for being disciplined and for doing, what you're told and being obedient and so on. And so he says that is the generation of the man of the people. That's the democratic man. So now Socrates brings that up because he says, well, assume again that such a man, now grown older, has a young son reared in turn in his father's dispositions. So this is where now the Tyrannic Soul is going to become possible. So we've seen how a democratic man can come into being. But now what if that guy's your dad? What if you grow up in the shadow of, or in the context of, that character of person we've just defined, which is the guy who's, not hostile to law and sort of trying to be good, but in fact doesn't really have any arguments against the celebration of exousia and so on, right? So, this child growing up is going to be in basically the same situation of having, good character sort of presented to him as something he should have, because his dad's trying to be a good guy, and so he's going to want his son to try to be a good guy. And on the other hand, he's going to have people around him celebrating license and so on. But, it's like, I don't know, it's kind of a hippie dad or something like that. Like, his dad isn't really going to have a lot of powerful ways to defend the idea that you shouldn't just give in to that stuff. In fact, his dad himself is pretty drawn by exousia. And so the idea that you should just do what you want is going to seem pretty plausible to that child growing up. Now again, that child could grow up in different ways, could become different things. But he says, this is the context in which it's really possible for the Tyrannic soul to develop, right? Because here, it's possible really to fall in love with exousia. And I say fall in love with, and I'm thinking of that strong sense of the word eros that we started to focus on at the end of book 5, right? And he says, what happens is, again, the other forces trying to draw him in one way, and, father and other relatives bring aid to the sort of middle desires, the ones that are going to try to be good. But then he says, when that other side, the side that's trying to draw him into exousia, the way those things win is when they implant some eros in him to be the leader of the idle desires. And so basically the tyrannic man comes into being when he develops a passion for exousia, a passion for satisfying whatever he feels like satisfying, when that becomes like the only thing he can see. So what is, a tyrannical person like? It's somebody who is completely hostile to law, someone who is opposed to the idea that they have to answer to anything else. And on the other hand, they are, passionately committed, overwhelmingly oriented towards the idea that they have to live in such a way as to satisfy whatever their immediate sense of personal satisfaction is. And so he says at 576a, wouldn't we be right in calling such men faithless? Like these are people you can't trust because they don't answer to anything, right? And so again, going back to the beginning of the sort of whole discussion of the city in book 2, Socrates said, the city comes into being because people need each other, right? And so trust, your ability to rely on someone else, is almost the most basic thing in human life. And that's what these people don't have. Right here, you have the complete betrayal of everything humanity stands for, everything humanity needs. Right? But so, what are these people going to be like in reality? Well, on the one hand, they from 575b to c, they say, how might they appear? On the one hand, as he says at 575b, you have people who will betray trust by stealing, by taking things that are not theirs to take, because that satisfies them. Or he says, they might lead men into slavery. Or that's what you're going to do if you're stuck in a situation where you just got to try to take advantage of what's around you. Or he says, they might go off. You might think, I want to go be in somebody's army or something like that. I want to get put in a position where I can work for someone tyrannical who will give me a situation where I can just take. So he says, they might become bodyguards to some other tyrant or auxiliaries for wages. People will do things to find an environment in which they can just get the stuff they want, disregarding matters of human value. But the most serious one is when you're in an environment with other people like that, and there are enough of you to actually shape things. Right? That's when the person with the most tyrannical soul can actually become a tyrant. Right? When you can have a group of people who are all going to work for that goal. But so now they talk about if you're really going to become the tyrant, the same sort of thing they analyzed at the end of book 8. How are you going to do that? And he says here at 575e, when these men are in private life before they rule, aren't they like this? In the first place, as to their company, either they have intercourse with their flatterers who are ready to serve them in everything, or if they need anything from anyone, they themselves dare to assume any posture, acting as though they belong to him. And when they have succeeded, they become quite alien. I mean, the point here is someone who wants to be a tyrant will do anything for that. And so that person will, abase himself. He'll be your slave if he thinks he can get something from you, even though he's later going to turn on you, right? But so to get in the position of being a tyrant, you have to be prepared to do, the worst things, being a slave for someone. He says, therefore they live their whole life without ever being friends of anyone, always one man's master or another's slave, right? It's related to that point of being faithless, which they mention right here, right? That there's no friendship. There's no human relationships in that sort of rich and vibrant sense. There are just masters and slaves. You're either effectively making yourself someone's slave so that you can get ahead, or you're going to enslave them, right? And that is the fairly barren human world that is produced. And so Socrates, who's talking with Adeimantus, says, right, so this is the worst, right? We've hit the bottom of the barrel. And then Glaucon comes into the conversation. And Socrates asks Glaucon, just in general, when we're talking about the Tyrannic Soul, aren't we saying that's an organization of the soul that's like the way a tyrant organizes a city? So he says at 576c, with respect to likeness, does the tyrannic man correspond to anything other than the city under a tyranny? Just as the man of the people corresponds to the city under a democracy, and so on. And, Glaucon agrees with that. And so Socrates says, with respect to virtue, what is the relationship between a city under a tyranny and the one under a kingship such as we first described? I guess the wise king, philosopher king. And Glaucon says everything is the opposite, because one is the best, the other is the worst. And Glaucon says, it's plain to everyone that there is no city more wretched than one under a tyranny, and none happier than one under a kingship. And so Socrates says, okay, well, about these same things, as they exist in men, would I also be right in suggesting that that man should be deemed fit to judge them, who is able with his thought to creep into a man's disposition and see through it, a man who is not like a child looking from outside and overwhelmed by the tyrannic pomp set up as a facade for those outside, but who rather sees through it adequately. So we want to be able to look through the wealth, the extravagance, the flattery that defines the public presentation of tyranny, and look inside the tyrant's soul. So he says, this is at 577c, he says, recalling for yourself the likeness of the city and the man, and reflecting on each in turn, tell me the state of both. So he says, speaking of the city, will you say that a city under a tyranny is free or slave? And Glaucon says, slave, in the highest possible degree. And so he says, but you will also see some people in it who are masters and free men, right? And Glaucon says, yes, you'll see a small part of that kind, but virtually the whole of it, and the most decent part, is slave, without honor and wretched. And he had said that back in Book 8, back at 567a to c, he said that, the tyrant, when he comes into power, has to get rid of free thinkers who, can imagine things differently. He's got to get rid of those people who are actually courageous enough to, even if they're on his side, to speak up to him if they think he's doing something wrong. He's going to get rid of anybody who's courageous enough to stand up to him. And basically, he's going to be opposed to everyone who's courageous, great-minded, prudent, or rich. Right? That's those are all the people that the tyrant is going to have as his enemy, and he's going to not let any of those people exist because they're potential rivals and threats to him. Right? So then Socrates says, okay, but if a man is like his city, isn't it also necessary that the same arrangement be in him, and that his soul be filled with much slavery and illiberality, and that further those parts of it that are most decent be slaves, while a small part, the most depraved and maddest, be master? And Glaucon agrees, right? But I think, so this is then the powerful point here, right? If you see, looking at a city, what tyranny really amounts to, the power of that, using the city as a lens for the soul, really comes up here, where you see what's really happening in that person is that everything good in that person is actually being forcibly shut down. And that person is kind of a slave to himself. He has been enslaved to that passion, which is itself kind of slave to desires, in that it's always having to answer to whatever sort of craving emerges. So he says, the tyrannic soul is poverty-ridden and insatiable, right? Like, this is a person who is actually a slave to whatever sort of desires pop up. And he says one further thing that I think is quite important. He says, doesn't a city that is slave and under a tyranny least do what it wants? And that's what it means for that city to be a slave. Like, it's suffering a bad rule. That city can't actually do anything good. But therefore, the soul that is under a tyranny similarly will least do what it wants. Right? So the tyrannic soul celebrating exousia makes it look like, oh, I can do whatever I want. The fact is, on the contrary, that person has become completely enslaved to whatever sort of whims and desires come up, and that person's life is spent chasing a kind of unattainable goal of satisfying what are ultimately insatiable desires. Whereas all the things in that person's soul that had something, constructive and valuable to contribute, something that could make him become a person of capability, of aspiration, all those things have been shut down, right? And so the tyrant started off saying, well, I want to be able to do whatever I want. But again, you see that what that really means is that there is no doing what he wants here. This is a person who is essentially driven by, what Sophocles, back in that initial conversation with Cephalus, called the many mad masters. And so, as he says again, in the city, will you find more complaining, sighing, lamenting, or suffering in any other city? No, you won't. So same thing, like, that's really what's happening in this person. Every sort of thing human in this person is in agony. Everything that person as a person ever could have wanted to be is left sad and crying, dominated by these insatiable desires. As Socrates says at 579 D and E, therefore, the real tyrant is, even if he doesn't seem so to someone, in truth a real slave to the greatest fawning and slavery, and a flatterer of the most worthless men. And with his desires getting no kind of satisfaction, he shows that he is most in need of the most things and poor in truth, if one knows how to look at a soul as a whole. Right, so he said that the tyrant shows that he's most in need of the most things and poor in truth, if one knows how to look at a soul as a whole. Right, the tyrant does show it if you know how to look for it. But so he's asking Glaucon here, go back and look at all the different types of men we've seen: the timocratic man, money-making man, democratic man, tyrannical man, and I guess before that the philosopher. Which one do you think is the best? And Glaucon makes his choice. So what Glaucon has got in that case to choose from is essentially a set of portraits that have been produced throughout Book 8. We can also go back to what we've seen, back at the beginning of the Republic. In Book 1, we got a kind of a portrait of Cephalus, portrait of Polemarchus, portrait of Thrasymachus, and, throughout all of this, we have a portrait of Socrates. In all of these cases, you as a reader have to actually be trying to make sense of who you're seeing. And that's the question. Can you see a soul as a whole? And I think just as the Tyrannic soul shows its problems, these people are all showing who they are by the way they behave, if you know how to see it. Right? A little later in Book 9, Socrates gives an image of this. And so he returns to that theme that we had, way back in Book 4, where we sort of divided up the soul into desire, spirit, and nous, and so on, the calculating part. Here he says he wants to put that in an image. And he says, basically, you want an image for what the desires are like. He says, those are like chimera or Kerberos, sort of many-headed beast. And then he says, if you think about the spirited part, that's kind of like a lion. That's the lion in you. And he says, the part that should have an image of a person is that calculating part, right? That's the part where you really can entertain ideas and insights and judge things and so on. So it's like these different parts of your soul are like these different sorts of animals in you, one of which is the sort of distinctively human part. So what's a person like? Well, a person is like these different kinds of animals inside him or herself. But the whole thing has the form of being a person. When you look at anyone looks like a person. Yet inside them, there is a community. But it's not exactly a human community. It's their distinctive sort of humanity in community with the liony part of their nature and with the many-headed beast part of their nature. And these things we've been talking about the organization of the soul, we modeled them on political organizations, but we can also see that's kind of the way these different aspects of ourselves, the many-headed beast aspect, the lion aspect, or the human aspect, have been put in positions of relative power. And so with someone like the tyrant, you have a person who looks like a person from the outside, but inside, whatever was human about them is so deeply enslaved, it's virtually invisible. And what you really have is that many-headed beast. Right? So anyway, I think this is a very powerful image for thinking that everything you see from the outside has the bodily appearance of being a person. But what you're really seeing is a relationship of many-headed beast, lion, and person. And that's what a person's soul, that's what the organization of a person's soul, that's what a person's character really is. And so to see a person as the person they are, you have to not be caught up in the pomp, so to speak, of the human clothing. But you have to be able to see through that to seeing what is the real arrangement in that person of these different dimensions, the beast dimension, the lion dimension, the human dimension, who's ruling and who's ruled. The issue with the tyrant's soul was, can you see what's really going on there? Can you see through the pomp that presents this thing as a great thing? Can you see that is really a person in whom their humanity is being forcibly held down by these tyrannic desires, right? Being enslaved. So can you recognize the reality of that situation of slavery? Well, that same point is made with respect to the political institution of slavery as well, right? So Socrates says at 578e, if some one of the gods were to lift one man who has 50 or more slaves out of the city and set him, with those slaves where none of the free men is going to be able to help him, what do you suppose would be the character of the fear that he would have that he's going to be destroyed by those domestic slaves? And Glaucon says, I think it would be extreme, right? So, in the household, all these people who are slaves say, yes, you're my master, I'll do what you tell me, and things roll along smoothly. But that's really a forceful holding down of these people who, if they could get away with doing what they want, would kill that guy, right? And he says, what if a god settled many other neighbors all around him who won't stand for any man's claiming to be another's master? And then Glaucon says, yeah, that would be even more serious. Well, so the point is that the only reason this guy can get away with having slaves is because his neighbors allow it, right? So, going back to those discussions in Book 5 where we talked about this already, right? There is a social order that's been habituated to thinking, oh, okay, it's okay for us to have these slaves. And it's only because that community of people collectively works to hold down these other people that there isn't a revolt, that those people don't refuse to be slaves and kill this person, right? So something that looks domestic and calm is actually a situation of extreme violence. So we already saw this theme back in Book 5, but again, I think we're seeing more here about sort of the problem of slavery. And then at the very end of Book 8, that issue is addressed again. So Socrates says that this is around 590 C and D. What about if there were someone where that sort of best part of that person was by nature so weak that he wasn't capable of ruling the beasts inside him, right? Could there be someone who just, in fact, naturally doesn't have sufficiently developed, those higher powers to be able to control himself, right? So he says, well, if that were the case, then it would be good for that person to be ruled, right? For that person to be made to act in healthy ways. And he says, it's not that we suppose in that case the slave must be ruled to his own detriment, as Thrasymachus supposed, but that it's better for all to be ruled by what is divine and prudent, especially when one has it as his own within himself, but if not, set over him from outside, so that insofar as possible all will be alike and friends piloted by the same thing, right? So to the extent that slave means unjustly forcing someone else to do stuff for you, that's going to be bad. But if you mean by that, is it ever right for one person to rule another? There's a very particular case in which it is. It is if that person is incapable of ruling themselves for the best. And he gives the example of children right after that as a case we're familiar with, where we expect the parents to do that, to require the children to act in ways that are in their best interest. Let's think further about this situation where there would be rule of people according to, having to act in light of what's best. And he says that's the law, right? The law is an ally of all in the city, and it does that thing. It sets over him from outside the rule that has to be followed. So, the tyrannic view began with the idea that freedom, eleutheria, takes the form of hostility to law. And I think that the point we get to by here is, quite the opposite. It's that what we can see is, it is when we are ruled by law that we are free, because that's when we are allowed to live in a way that is governed by the best. So, I said before in Book 8 that it seems to me the discussion of democracy as eleutheria, kind of the positive account of democracy, was never presented to us. And it seems like here we're getting a bit of a version of what that might be, right? The notion of exousia was, he called it the law of equality, right? Where you just say everything's as good as everything else. And I think what we're getting as, eleutheria as opposed to exousia is equality under the law, right? It's the idea that you can establish a system of rule which directs people into how to behave well. that stuff about the Tyrant Soul is really the heart of Book 9. But there's some other pretty interesting stuff in here, too. So you remember I was saying that books 2 to 4 more or less focus on the spirited dimension of the soul. But then I was saying that books 5 through 7 were really giving us a kind of richer reevaluation of what was introduced in book 4 as the calculating part. And then I was saying that books 8 and 9 take us into a reconsideration of the notion of the desiring part. So we've already seen a bit of that in book 8. But now in book 9, Socrates begins by saying, "Do you know what I still miss?" And remember I made this point before, that he said the thing that really comes from a good musical education is that you can see what's missing. And that's what Socrates emphasizes here. And he says, "In my opinion, we haven't adequately distinguished the kinds and number of the desires. And with this lacking, the investigation we are making will be less clear." That theme of desire is running throughout Book 9 because, of course, that's at the center of how we've been describing the Tyrant Soul. But then especially after that discussion, Socrates says he's going to go revisit the discussion of desire from Book 4. And I want to make a couple of points about that. So he says at 580d, "Just as a city is divided into 3 forms, so the soul of every single man also is divided in 3, which is a point that they've sort of been bringing up already. And then he says, "It looks to me as though there were also a 3-fold division of pleasures corresponding to these 3, a single pleasure peculiar to each one, and similarly a 3-fold division of desires and kinds of rule." So he's going to then associate a kind of desire with each of these 3 sort of major divisions in the soul that we were formerly thinking of broadly calling desiring, spirited, and calculating, and also 3 kinds of rule. But here we're re-entering that discussion of desire. But the particular approach he takes to it is this issue of 3 kinds of pleasure. And basically, his point is that any activity we engage in successfully accomplishing it, it brings with it a kind of pleasure. So getting pleasure isn't distinctive of that part that we formerly might have called the desiring part. Rather, the different dimensions of our psychological life find pleasure in different kinds of activity or achievement. And so he distinguishes then the part that we formerly called the desiring part. He distinguishes that as the part that is characterized by a love of gain and the pleasure associated with gain, or with getting. That's at 581a. The spirited part then has a particular pleasure, and that's the pleasure associated with the love of victory, pleasure of winning. But then the part that we've sometimes called the calculating part, that has a particular pleasure that is associated with knowing. And I want to read the particular thing he says about the pleasure associated with knowing and so on. He refers to that at 581d as the pleasure of knowing the truth as it is and always being in some such state of pleasure while learning. So I want to come back and talk about that passage a little bit later. Anyway, the point he makes is that these pleasures dispute with each other, right? So the person who's, fundamentally allowed themselves to be defined by that part that loves gain, has the view that the pleasure of gain is the greatest pleasure. That person who allows themselves to be defined by that love of victory believes the pleasure of winning to be the greatest pleasure. And the person who allows themselves to be defined by the knowing part experiences the pleasure of knowing as the greatest pleasure. So there you can see again that those 3 types of 3 dimensions of soul are also 3 types of rule, as he said, right? You can let each of those different kinds of desiring be the thing that is in charge of organizing and controlling your soul. But also, he says, those pleasures sort of compete with each other, right? He says the pleasures of each form and the life itself associated with it dispute with one another, not about the question of which is living more nobly or shamefully or worse or better, but about living more pleasantly, right? So each of those people allowing themselves to be dominated by those different parts, as I said, claims that pleasure is the most pleasant. Notice that that also means that the issue of competition is also inescapably present in every kind of desiring and pleasure, right? Because these different pleasures vie with one another. So that love of victory, or that issue of victory, isn't just cast off in some isolated part of the soul. All of these levels of soul in some way are involved in competition and with each other and trying to win. And notice also that that means that argument is involved at every level of soul, because each one of these is putting forth a thesis, right? That competition is about a claim that this thing is true and that thing is false, right? So notice then that this means that, he says he's reevaluating, desire and so on, and that's certainly true. But implicit in that is the recognition that those other two things we identified, the issue of victory and the issue of knowing, also can't just be held off in some isolated part, but they are being deployed in a life ruled by any of these sort of governing systems, right? Anyway, so notice then that it's not neither of these two things that a person might say is actually correct. It's not right to say about some people that they want to do what's pleasant, but what other people do isn't pleasant, right? Everybody at some level is finding pleasure in the thing they do, although that isn't necessarily the reason they're doing it. They're not necessarily doing it for the sake of the pleasure, but they are getting pleasure in all of these things. But second, it's not right to say that it's obvious what pleasure is, right? The sense of what it is to be pleasing, what is pleasurable, changes depending on how you organize your soul, right? So it's not just that a certain thing just is or isn't pleasant, simpliciter. Pleasant is always in a way pleasant for. It's pleasant in the way it speaks to the kind of person you are. And as you change the kind of person you are, what it is that appeals to you, what it is that seems pleasant, also changes. Right? So notice then that the theme of perspective that has come up before is coming up here again, right? That when you let these different dimensions of your soul rule, or in people for whom different dimensions of soul rule, those people have different perspectives. What counts as pleasant changes depending on that perspective. Not unrelated to the point I was making about necessary and unnecessary desires when we talked about Book 8. So here, these pleasures or these forms of life are competing with one another, right? And that means, as I said there, each of the different forms of life has built into it an attempt to judge and say this one is better, right? But so, judgment or arguing is going on in all of them. So the thing is, you can be better or worse at arguing. You can be better or worse at judging, right? And so the particular point that's being made here is there is a way to assess these different pleasures and ask which one is superior. And that is inherently a matter of judgment. It's an assessment. Right? And so the person who is better at assessing is the person who can come up with a better answer there. And it is the person who has cultivated the assessing part who is in fact going to be better at judging these disparate claims. But I want to pick up on just one further point, right? They go on then to talk a little bit further about desires. And Socrates says, we want to notice that there's, again, a little bit of ambiguity in the way people talk about pleasures. So, and basically the distinction is between what you might call relative pleasures and absolute pleasures. And so he says, commonly what people find pleasant is a relief of a kind of pain. And he says, yeah, that might be right. I mean, there is a kind of pleasure there. But notice that it is a sort of, it's a way of you experiencing your pain to take pleasure in the relief of it. Right? And he wants to distinguish that from a kind of pleasure that's not defined by pain. Right? Something that's intrinsically or absolutely pleasant, not just relatively pleasant. And he compares that, he says, to the issue of up, down, and middle. So he says, imagine somebody who's always looking down. If they then look a little less down and look towards something that's kind of in the middle, they will be, relatively speaking, looking up compared to what they were looking at. And they might say, oh, that's up, right? But they haven't looked all the way up. Well, that issue, you should remember, came up explicitly in Book 7 when Glaucon thought that things about the stars were more related to ultimate truths because they were up there in the heavens. And Socrates says, you got the wrong sense of up. When we're talking about the person in the cave having to sort of look up, we don't mean look up in the sky. We mean, turn to a different kind of dimension of reality. So Glaucon, thinking he was looking up, was pointedly still stuck in the very domain he was supposed to be looking away from. So he was, in the sense that Socrates had in mind, he was still looking down. Well, so that point comes up again here, right? That you can make the mistake of thinking you're looking up while you're still, in fact, looking down, just within that domain of down, looking at something that's sort of in a relatively different position. And that's then like that issue of pleasure and pain. So he then wants to look at those pleasures that don't come out of pains. He gives the example of a smell. He says, the pleasures of smell without previous pain suddenly become extraordinarily great, and once having ceased, leave no pain behind. So the point he's trying to make is that it's not answering to painful craving or something like that. The thing is sort of spontaneously and independently pleasing. That should make you think of other things, right? It should make you think, I imagine, of tastes. You like the taste of some things, right? So it means you need to distinguish in eating between eating for the sake of satisfying hunger, which is a kind of thing they've talked about and that they're going to continue talking about, versus eating because you like the taste of the thing. Very different pleasures are involved. There are very different motivations. But then that suggests a few other things too, right? Notice the thing that's being highlighted here then is precisely something that's not obviously useful in the sense that it's not satisfying a lack, or fulfilling something that you immediately need. Right? So, back in Book 8, they distinguished between the money-making desires and the spendthrifty desires. They said that, the oligarch only wants to pursue those things that are conducive to money-making. Right, and so his son, for example, at 558, he had to control the pleasures in himself that are spendthrifty and that do not conduce to money-making, which, they call unnecessary. Right, so, there are things that sometimes you feel like doing, but the stingy guy says, well, you don't need to do that because it's not going to make any money. Right, it's not satisfying some immediate need you have. Yeah, okay, well, those things were sort of being condemned at various points. They're condemned by the oligarch. But that seems to be exactly the thing now that Socrates is in a way celebrating. The spendthrifty desires, the thing that is, where you just go for it without getting something else in return, without satisfying some lack that you were working on. Right? They're not instrumental, they're not useful. Right? And you might think of other things, like maybe the delight that you would take in poetry or music or painting. Right, that, again, I think, like what he says here about the sense of smell, is something that gives a kind of pleasure, not because it's relieving a pain, but just because it's, intrinsically enjoyable. And when it goes away, it doesn't leave a pain. But anyway, so that's an interesting study in its own right. The particular purpose of the study here, though, it seems to me, is that he wants to talk about the real desires that relate to that real sense of up. And so he then goes on to say, well, what's it like to get nourishment? And he says, you can do all these things to fulfill the body, which is responding to hunger and thirst and so on. And what they do is they take the emptiness of the body's condition and fill it. I think that's a movement from basically pain to pleasure. Hunger and thirst which are those kind of definitive kinds of desire that we used in Book 4 to define this first part of the soul. And what he's calling here examples of pursuit of gain, it seems to me he's here saying that gain is the filling of an emptiness. And it's because, you feel hungry, you feel the pain of emptiness, and you seek to satisfy that, right? So the pleasures of eating and thirst there seems like those have to do with the relative sense of overcoming a pain. He then compares that to learning and getting rid of ignorance. Well, I think that's a similar thing. It seems to me that overcoming ignorance, like overcoming hunger, is you're going to get a certain kind of pleasure, but it's answering to a certain kind of pain. But he says, what is it that you're really dealing with when you're moving from ignorance to knowledge? Well, you're dealing with the real up, right? The pleasure you're getting has to do with turning around in that cave sense and putting yourself in the position of relating to those things that truly are. So it seems to me that in that case, the pleasure of learning, to the extent that it's a removal of ignorance, is like a relative pleasure of removing pain, rather as the pleasure of eating and the pleasure of drinking are relative pleasures that come from removing the pain of hunger and thirst. But the thing that's interesting about learning is that it puts us in the domain of relating to the things that are the true up, and relating to those things that simply are. And then let's go back to that line I read before. He said, won't the lover of wisdom have a pleasure which is the pleasure of knowing the truth as it is, and always being in some such state of pleasure while learning, right? So there he's actually drawing your attention to two things: the pleasure of knowing the truth as it is, and a pleasure like that comes with the pleasure of learning. And I think that's an important distinction then. So I think learning, as I said, like eating, is in part a satisfying of a pain. But what it does is it gets you to the state of knowing. And I think that living in knowledge is then the example he really has in mind of something that gives a pleasure that is intrinsic and not relative. Right? It's the pleasure of knowing. That is not a state of striving now. That is a state of repose. Right? And he talked about a state of repose. He said, this was back at 583 C and D. He said, sometimes when people are sick, don't they say then that nothing is more pleasant than being healthy? But before they were sick, it had escaped their notice. Yeah, there is a state you're in where actually life is very pleasant and you're very happy. But the very nature of it is that it doesn't draw attention to itself. It actually, empowers you to go and do other things. Right? When you're healthy, you just do stuff. You can have a life. And so that repose is a very powerful experience of pleasure that's noticed when you lose it. And that you could notice when you have it, though you typically, I suppose, don't. But it's not a pleasure of pursuing something and then satisfying a lack. It's a pleasure of being in a good state, right? And that should also remind you of way back in Book 2 when they were talking about a healthy body and they were talking about virtue. This is at around 380E and 381A. He says, are things that are in the best condition least altered and moved by something else. For example, a body by food, drink, and labor, right? When you're healthy, you can eat something. It might not even be that good a thing for you, but you're going to be fine. You can work hard, but it's not going to hurt you. But when your body's weak and in a bad state, like eating something that's unhealthy is going to knock you right out. And having to do work is just going to knock you right out. And he says, in a soul that is most courageous and most prudent, wouldn't an external affection least trouble and alter it? I mean, again, when you're in a virtuous state, you're strong, right? You're resilient, right? So establishing health in your body, establishing health, which is to say virtue in your soul, puts you in a position of repose where you're not struggling to get somewhere. You've achieved the healthy position at which you are very strong, and from which all kinds of powerful and worthwhile things can be done. Right? And so I think similarly then, knowledge is like that. Right? And so I think the point there then is that there is the profound pleasure of being a certain kind of person.